Some tremors can't be diagnosed by doctors. Some shaking isn't physical at all. For as long as I could remember, my grandfather's hands trembled. Not the gentle quiver of age, but the persistent tremor of a man carrying something far heavier than years. Reverend Thomas Parker, the soft-spoken pastor of Millbrook Chapel, was known for his gentle sermons and thoughtful prayers. What most didn't notice was how he gripped the pulpit each Sunday, knuckles white, as if to steady himself against an invisible storm. I never questioned it as a child, just assumed it was what happened when you got old. It wasn't until I found the Bible in his attic, leather-worn smooth pages filled with names, each accompanied by a simple prayer, that I began to understand. Vietnam wasn't just a war my grandfather had witnessed from the safety of a chaplain's tent. It was a battlefield he had never left, and those shaking hands had been fighting there for 50 years. Millbrook was the kind of small town that time seemed to forget, nestled in the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania. Main Street consisted of a diner, a hardware store, a post office, and the chapel where my grandfather had preached since before I was born. After my parents' divorce, I spent every summer with him in the white clapboard house behind the church. A quiet place where the only consistent sounds were the ticking grandfather clock in the hall and the whispered prayers my grandfather offered when he thought no one was listening. At 75, Reverend Thomas Parker was a gentle fixture in the community, respected but never truly known. He attended town meetings, blessed new babies, comforted the dying, and delivered sermons that spoke of peace and forgiveness in a voice that rarely rose above conversational tone. But there was a distance about him, a quiet reservation that kept even those closest to him at arm's length. I was 24 the summer everything changed. Recently graduated with a history degree I wasn't sure how to use, drifting back to Millbrook more out of habit than intention. My grandfather had begun to slow down, his arthritis making it difficult to maintain the old house. I had offered to help clear out the attic, a space I'd never been allowed to explore as a child. "Just old memories up there," he had always said, changing the subject whenever I asked. "Nothing worth disturbing." But on a rainy June afternoon, as I sorted through dust-covered boxes of church bulletins and theological texts, I discovered just how wrong he had been. Behind a stack of hymnals lay a Bible different from any I'd seen him use, its leather cover cracked and darkened with age, its pages swollen from what I would later realize were decades of tears. The Bible was military-issued, compact enough to fit in a rucksack with a canvas cover designed to withstand jungle humidity. Inside the front cover, in careful block letters, was written, "Chaplain Thomas Parker, 1st Battalion, 12th Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division, Vietnam, 1968 to 1969. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor, dust motes dancing in the beams of afternoon light, filtering through the small window. Downstairs, I could hear my grandfather moving about the kitchen, the familiar sound of the kettle whistling for his afternoon tea. He had no idea what I had found. The Bible fell open naturally to the middle, where the binding had been worn from repeated use. The margins of the pages were filled with handwriting, not notes on scripture but names, dozens of them, each followed by a date and a brief prayer. David Miller, May 12, 1968. Lord, receive this good man into your arms. Help his mother understand. Help me understand. Michael Torres, June 3, 1968. He was 19, Lord, just 19. Guide him home. James Wilson, October 17, 1968. He died asking for forgiveness. I told him it was already granted. Was I right, Lord? Was I right? Page after page, the names continued. Some prayers were longer, some just a few words. Some names had small crosses drawn beside them. Others had question marks. In the back of the Bible, on the blank pages typically left for family records, was a different list. Names without dates, with the heading, "Those I Couldn't Reach." I was so absorbed that I didn't hear my grandfather's approach until the floorboard creaked behind me. I turned to find him standing in the attic doorway, teacup forgotten in his trembling hand, his eyes fixed on the open Bible in my lap. "Ethan," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "Where did you find that?" "Behind some hymnals," I replied, feeling suddenly like an intruder. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry." He stood motionless for a long moment, then slowly set down his cup on a nearby box. The tea sloshed over the rim, but he didn't seem to notice. "It's been up here almost 40 years, he said finally. I thought perhaps God had forgotten about it too. There was something in his tone I'd never heard before, not anger at my discovery, but a profound weariness, as if speaking of the Bible had suddenly added weight to his already stooped shoulders. "Who are they?" I asked gently. "All these names." He crossed the attic with careful steps and lowered himself beside me, his arthritic joints protesting. When he reached for the Bible, I noticed his hands were shaking more than usual. "Boys," he said simply. "Just boys. Some no older than you were when you used to catch fireflies in the backyard." He ran his finger down one column of names. "This one played the guitar. This one had just gotten married. This one showed me pictures of the '57 Chevy he was restoring back home." His finger stopped at a name, Joseph Winters, beside which was written only Y. Some deaths I could make sense of, find some meaning in. Others, he shook his head. Joseph died because he tripped over a root while carrying coffee to his friend. Stepped right on a mine. There was no lesson there, no divine purpose I could point to. Just senselessness. I had never heard my grandfather speak this way. In church, he always had answers, always found meaning in suffering. Always pointed to God's greater plan. "Is this why your hands shake?" I asked, the question escaping before I could consider its bluntness. He looked down at his trembling fingers as if noticing them for the first time. "Perhaps," he acknowledged, "though I've never thought of it that way. The doctors call it essential tremor. But yes, perhaps it started there, in the jungle, when I realized that sometimes faith isn't enough. Sometimes prayers go unanswered." He closed the Bible gently, his palm resting on its worn cover. "I've never shown this to anyone, Ethan. Not even your grandmother knew about these names, these prayers." "Why not?" His eyes, when they met mine, held a depth of pain I had never witnessed before. "Because I failed them," he whispered. "Every single one." Over dinner that evening, a simple meal of meatloaf and mashed potatoes that my grandfather had prepared despite my offers to cook, we barely spoke. The Bible sat between us on the kitchen table like an unexpected guest, its presence altering the familiar rhythm of our conversation. Finally, as I was washing dishes, I gathered my courage. "What happened to the chapel where you served?" "In Vietnam?" My grandfather paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "What makes you think there was a chapel?" "Some of the prayers," I said. "You mentioned a sanctuary, an altar. Wasn't there a chapel on the base?" He set down his fork with deliberate care. "Not much of one. Just a tent at first, then a simple wooden structure when it became clear we'd be there a while. The men called it Parker's Peace Palace. Their little joke." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "It wasn't much, but it was sacred in its way." "Does it still exist? The base, I mean." "Cam Ranh Bay? Parts of it, I suppose. The Vietnamese military uses some of it now, but the American presence is long gone." He studied me with sudden suspicion. "Why do you ask?" I dried my hands on a dish towel, choosing my words carefully. "I've been thinking about what to do next. With my history degree, This was true, if incomplete. I've been considering a focus on war memorials, sacred spaces in conflict zones. It's becoming an important subfield. My grandfather was no fool. His eyes narrowed slightly. And you're suddenly interested in this because I abandoned pretense. Because I found that Bible. Because I've known you my whole life and never knew you carried this. Because your hands shake when you pray, and now I understand why. His expression softened. Ethan, there's more, I continued. There's a chapel in Virginia near Quantico. It was built as a replica of the field chapels in Vietnam. I've been reading about it online. They maintain it as a memorial. This wasn't something I'd known before today. I had researched it frantically on my phone while he napped that afternoon. The Chapel of Peace, it was called, constructed by returning chaplains as a place of remembrance and healing. I know about it, he said quietly. I was invited to its dedication in 1985. Did you go? He shook his head. I couldn't. Would you go now? I asked. With me? The question hung in the air between us. Outside, evening had settled over Millbrook, fireflies beginning their nightly dance in the garden my grandfather tended with careful precision. Why would you want that? He finally asked. Because I think you need it, I said honestly, and because I want to understand. All my life, you've been the gentle preacher, the man who speaks of forgiveness and grace, but you've never applied those things to yourself, have you? His hands, those perpetually trembling hands, gripped the edge of the table. It's not that simple. I know it's not. That's why we should go. I have 2 weeks before I need to be back for job interviews. We could drive down, take our time. The doctors say I shouldn't travel far, he protested weakly. My heart is breaking, I finished for him. Has been for 50 years. Maybe this could help. He looked at the Bible, then back at me. For a moment I glimpsed something unexpected in his eyes. Not resistance, but longing. As if I had offered water to a man who had been thirsting for decades but had forgotten how to ask. I'll need to find someone to cover Sunday services, he said finally. It wasn't a yes, not exactly, but it was enough. That night I heard him in his study, the murmur of his voice rising and falling in prayer. When I passed the half-open door, I saw him with the Bible open on his desk, his trembling finger tracing the names he had carried for half a century. For the first time I wondered if those shaking hands weren't a symptom, but a prayer in themselves. A physical manifestation of a plea too profound for words. We left Millbrook on a Tuesday morning in my grandfather's aging Buick. The Bible carefully packed in his worn leather satchel along with a change of clothes and his medications. Reverend Matthews from the neighboring town had agreed to cover services, though my grandfather had been vague about why he was leaving. Personal matter was all he'd told the curious church secretary. Family business with Ethan. The drive to Virginia would take most of the day, with stops for my grandfather to stretch his arthritic legs and take his heart medication. He was silent as we pulled away from the white clapboard house, his eyes fixed on the chapel he'd served for 4 decades. I wondered if he was saying goodbye, if somehow he sensed this journey might change everything. We can turn around any time, I assured him as we reached the town limits. Just say the word. He shook his head. When I was a chaplain, I used to tell the boys to face their fears. The only way out is through, I'd say. Seems I should take my own advice for once. As the miles passed, something remarkable happened. My grandfather began to talk, really talk, about Vietnam. Not the sanitized version I'd occasionally glimpsed in his sermons, where suffering always had purpose and faith always prevailed. This was raw, honest, and sometimes brutal. We were based near Cam Ranh Bay, he explained as fields and forests slipped past our windows. Relatively safe compared to some areas, but we still took mortar fire. Still had casualties. I held services wherever I could, sometimes in the mess tent, sometimes under the stars. The chapel came later after I'd been there about 6 months. Who built it? I asked. The men did in their spare time. Salvaged lumber, donated supplies. One boy, Rodriguez, he'd been an apprentice carpenter before being drafted. He designed the altar. My grandfather's voice softened. He never saw it completed. Took a sniper round 2 weeks before we finished. Is his name in the Bible? Yes, they all are. Every man I prayed with, counseled, served communion to, every man I tried to prepare for what might come. His trembling hands fidgeted with the air conditioning vent, and every man I failed. I wanted to protest that he couldn't have saved them, that their deaths weren't his responsibility, but I sensed he needed to speak without interruption. A chaplain's job is to bring God's presence into darkness, he continued. To assure young men facing death that they aren't alone, that their sacrifice has meaning, that grace awaits them. But sometimes, he paused, swallowing hard. Sometimes I didn't believe it myself. How could I? 19-year-olds bleeding out in mud, crying for their mothers, boys who'd never even voted in an election dying for reasons they couldn't articulate. We stopped at a roadside diner in Pennsylvania for lunch. My grandfather barely touched his club sandwich, but he drank 3 cups of coffee, his hands shaking so badly with the 3rd cup that I had to help him set it down. The tremor started after a particularly bad week, he said, noticing my glance. 7 men from our unit killed in an ambush. I conducted 7 memorial services in 3 days. After the last one, I went back to my tent and found I couldn't hold my Bible. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. He looked down at his gnarled fingers. They never really have. Back on the road, I asked the question that had been forming since I found the Bible. The names with question marks beside them. Who were they? His response was so quiet I almost missed it. The ones who died without me. The ones I couldn't get to in time. I would hear later. This squad was hit, that patrol didn't come back, and add their names. But I always wondered, if I had been there, could I have offered some comfort in their final moments? Would they have died feeling less alone? As we crossed the Virginia state line, the weight of what we were doing finally settled fully on my shoulders. This wasn't just a historic curiosity or an academic exercise. For my grandfather, we were journeying back to the source of a wound that had been bleeding silently for 50 years. We arrived at our destination as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the grounds of what had once been a military training facility. The Chapel of Peace stood apart from the other buildings, a simple wooden structure set in a clearing surrounded by tall pines. Unlike the grand memorials in Washington, D.C., this place wasn't designed to impress. It existed to remember. It's smaller than I expected, I said as we parked in the empty gravel lot. My grandfather didn't respond. He sat motionless in the passenger seat, his trembling hands clutching the Bible in his lap, his gaze fixed on the chapel as if he were seeing something else entirely. Perhaps the original structure thousands of miles and decades away. We can wait until tomorrow if you'd prefer, I offered. It's getting late. No. His voice was firm despite its softness. I've waited long enough. The chapel's caretaker, a Vietnam veteran named Powell who had corresponded with me by email, met us at the entrance. He was a barrel-chested man with a silver crew cut and the ramrod posture of someone who had never fully left the military. Reverend Parker, he said, extending his hand to my grandfather. It's an honor, sir. I've heard your name from other chaplains who served. My grandfather shook his hand with visible surprise. You have? Powell nodded. You're something of a legend among the chaplain corps, though you might not know it. The men you served with, those who made it home, they remembered you. Said you were always there when the shooting started, never safe in the rear. The information struck me like a physical blow. In all his stories today, my grandfather had spoken of his shortcomings, his doubts, his failures. Not once had he mentioned courage. Powell unlocked the chapel door. We usually close at 5, but when your grandson explained your history, I thought you might appreciate some private time here. Take as long as you need. I'll be in the visitor center next door. He left us at the threshold. My grandfather stood frozen, staring into the dimly lit interior. Do you want me to come with you? I asked. He shook his head slowly. I think I need to do this part alone, Ethan. If that's all right. Of course. I'll wait here. I watched as he stepped inside, his stooped figure silhouetted against the amber light filtering through a simple stained glass window at the far end. The glass depicted not saints or biblical scenes, but the medical caduceus superimposed on a cross, the symbol of military chaplains who served alongside medical units. Through the open door, I could see my grandfather moving slowly down the center aisle, past rough-hewn pews that might have been crafted by the same hands as those in the original chapel. He approached the altar, a simple wooden table, and stood before it, head bowed. From where I stood, I couldn't hear his words, but I could see him open the Bible, placing it carefully on the altar. Then he did something I'd never witnessed in all the years I'd known him. He sank to his knees. The sunset light through the stained glass cast patterns of red and gold across his white hair, across his shoulders bent by age and memory, across his hands lifted in a gesture both supplicating and offering. Those hands, always in motion, always trembling, were fully extended now, as if presenting the Bible and all it contained to something beyond himself. I don't know how long he knelt there. Long enough for the light to fade from gold to purple to deep blue. Long enough for my legs to grow stiff from standing in the doorway. Long enough that I began to worry about his arthritic knees, his weak heart. But when he finally rose and turned back toward the door, toward me, his face held an expression I had never seen before, a lightness, an openness, as if some internal door had finally been unlocked. He walked back down the aisle slowly, one hand trailing along the pew tops for support. When he reached me, he held out the other hand, steady and still. They were waiting for me, he said simply. All of them. We spent the night at a small motel near the chapel, neither of us speaking much about what had happened. My grandfather seemed deep in thought, occasionally nodding to himself as if continuing an internal conversation. Once I caught him looking at his hands with an expression of quiet wonder. In the morning, we returned to the Chapel of Peace. Powell was already there, sweeping the steps, and greeted us with a nod. Thought you might be back, he said. Most chaplains do. Once isn't enough. This time, my grandfather invited me to join him inside. The chapel looked different in morning light, less mysterious, more welcoming. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass, casting colored patterns across the simple altar. I'd like to show you something, my grandfather said, leading me to the back wall where hundreds of small brass plates were mounted, each bearing a name, rank, and date. The memorial wall. Every chaplain who served in Vietnam is remembered here, along with key members of their congregations. He pointed to a section near the center. Thomas Parker, Captain, 1st Battalion, 12th Infantry Regiment, 4th Infantry Division, 1968 to 1969. Beneath his name were others, names I recognized from the Bible. David Miller, Michael Torres, James Wilson, Joseph Winters. I spoke their names last night, my grandfather said quietly. Every single one, not just a list of the dead, but a roll call of souls I was privileged to know, however briefly. I told them about my life since Vietnam, about your grandmother, about you, about the chapel in Millbrook. I told them I was sorry I hadn't been stronger, wiser, more faithful. And I prompted gently when he fell silent, and I realized something I've been missing for 50 years. He turned to face me fully. Grace isn't just something we receive, Ethan. It's something we have to extend to ourselves. Those boys never blamed me for not saving them. That was a burden I chose to carry. He flexed his hands, studying them with a mixture of surprise and recognition. All these years I've been clenching my fists around grief, around guilt. No wonder they shook. They were never meant to hold so much for so long. Powell approached, carrying a small brass plate and an engraving tool. Reverend Parker, we have a tradition here. Chaplains who visit can add a name to the wall. Someone who might have been overlooked, someone whose story needs to be remembered. My grandfather considered this, then said, Thomas Parker. Powell looked confused. Sir, your name is already here. Not Captain Parker, my grandfather clarified. Private Parker, the young man who went to Vietnam thinking he could make sense of suffering, who believed his faith was unshakable. The young man who never really came home. He touched the wall gently. He deserves to be remembered too. Powell nodded in understanding and set to work creating the small memorial. While he worked, my grandfather and I sat in the front pew, the Bible open between us. For the first time, he showed me not just the names and prayers, but the brief notes he had made about each man, hometowns, favorite songs, dreams for when they returned home. They were never just casualties to me, he explained. They were children of God. Sacred, precious. Even in the midst of that hell, perhaps especially there, I saw the divine spark in each of them. He closed the Bible gently. Maybe that's why losing them hurt so much. It felt like watching light being extinguished over and over again. But you kept the light alive, I said, understanding finally dawning. Every time you wrote their names, every time you prayed, every time you trembled, he smiled. A real smile that reached his eyes, erasing decades of sorrow, if only for a moment. Yes, he agreed. I suppose I did. When Powell finished the new nameplate, my grandfather stood to inspect it. His fingers traced the freshly engraved letters, and I noticed something remarkable. His hands were perfectly still. We returned to Millbrook the following Sunday, arriving just in time for my grandfather to conduct the morning service. The congregation, never large but devoted, filled the first few pews, curious about their pastor's unexpected absence. I sat in the back, watching as my grandfather approached the pulpit. He moved differently now, his shoulders straighter, his steps more certain despite his arthritis. The Bible he placed before him was not the weathered military edition from Vietnam, but the familiar one he had used for decades in this small chapel. Brothers and sisters, he began, his voice stronger than I had ever heard it. I want to speak to you today about grace. As he delivered his sermon, weaving together scripture, personal experience, and profound theological insights, his hands remained steady, no longer gripping the pulpit for support, but gesturing naturally to emphasize his points. No one else seemed to notice this transformation, but tears blurred my vision as I witnessed the physical manifestation of his inner healing. After the service, several parishioners commented that the Reverend seemed renewed, though they couldn't quite identify what had changed. I knew, but kept the knowledge close, a sacred trust between grandson and grandfather. That evening, as we sat on his porch watching fireflies illuminate the gathering dusk, My grandfather reached over and took my hand. His touch was firm, warm, and completely still. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" He smiled, the peace in his eyes matching the stillness of his hands. "For helping me find my way home." Some journeys cover thousands of miles. Others cover only the distance between a clenched fist and an open palm. My grandfather had finally completed both.